Back on record, and before our short recess, we did view clear training, and just to follow up on that, was wondering if there were any comments, questions, discussion from the board on what we viewed. TJ, anything?
Well, I found the clear training to add value, and just to reiterate, the structure. And I think it was valuable to be reminded of the structure of why we do what we do and what things to consider. Kind of like seeing it on a slideshow, not in black and white, in color. It was helpful again, especially since it's my first year at it did add value.
I think I just had a quick comment. One, I think I figured out what in camera was. Is that sort of our closed session?
Yeah.
Thank you. Two, doesn't matter what you do to get rid of your Canadian accent, you're always going to say a boat. Really, the third one was, I found it interesting that part of that training sort of included evaluation of us. And I thought that would be interesting. And so I don't know if that has happened in the past or if it would be of value. And I know that the presenter mentioned the sort of the reluctance perhaps of some folks that are coming to this on a voluntary basis to be evaluated. But personally, I think it would be very valuable feedback for me.
Certainly, when I first viewed that webinar, I saw some of the best practices that were mentioned in the webinar of things that we already do. And so before she was talking about evaluating the board or the board members themselves, she was talking about determining points of evaluation. Like, what are your measurements? What are your markers? What are your successes? And I think that's really the statistical reports that you see in the agenda materials and your disciplinary statistics and those kind of things lead towards that same idea. So certainly if it's an exercise that you want to explore attempting internally as a matter of self-reflection, I certainly see the value in it.
Did you specifically mean the board as in the board staff or the board as in the board panel? Because I thought the board panel would be interesting.
I would be open to both.
Oh,
Yeah.
me too.
I think there is more information on that topic in the Clear Resources Library, and so I'll look into it.
Awesome.
I thought the slideshow was very informative and very resourceful. And she referenced a book, The Imperfect Board Member by Jim Brown. I'm definitely going to look into that. Definitely. Couldn't wait to come write myself a note for that.
Yeah, it's on my list as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, something she mentioned that stuck in my mind was, how do you know that what you're doing works? And I guess that can be applied to everything.
Yeah.
And at the moment, I thought of the surveys that we had spoke about earlier, and how a survey for multiple things might be able to give us information to know if what we're doing is working, depending on who our audience is. Licensees or applicants or the public or what have you.
So it's good to hear that it was worthy. There are 4 more components, and I think for the August meeting, the component that's titled professional. Let me look at it real quick because there's another one in there that might be better. What you took today was roles of a board member, but administrative rulemaking might be a good one for the next round.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll put that on the agenda as the training component.
Thank you, Jason. Any further board comment? Any public comment? Okay, hearing none. Let's move to agenda item number 8, and I'm going to ask if Jason has any update or outcome.
Yes, so we have reached out to Sac State. No, right, agenda item?
No.
Oh, we're on the exempt status, okay, wrong number. So we did receive notification on April 21st that the request for a reevaluation or reassessment of the exempt status of the executive officer was not approved. In that request, with the help of DCA, forwarded on to CalHR, this board requested CalHR to take a look at the composition of the board, how much it's grown over the years, and reconsider whether or not the level or the position status of the executive officer was still appropriate. Nothing to do with my performance in particular, but where I sit in the hierarchy or the organizational chart of this board. A good example of where I'm at right now that creates issues is compaction between the executive officer and management. And so as the staff has grown and more managers have come into the fold with this board, there's no room to put a assistant executive officer between I and those managers because there would be a reporting issue amongst peers. So there's a number of different reasons to reclass the position, none of which have anything to do with the performance of that executive officer, but really the composition of the board and its size. The last time that this board was assessed was in 2000. And since then, in the request that you sent to CalHR, we had 100% increases in a number of different categories, double this and double that. More licensees, a larger budget, more complexity, higher education level for qualification for licensure, and so on and so forth. So on the 21st, we did receive notification that request was not approved.
And do we know what level that was?
The request at the time was level L, which is equivalent to that of a CEA or career executive assignment within state service. I currently sit in O, and O is a staff services manager 2. The managers that we have at our board are staff service managers 1. And so if I was to try to form a BCP or a budget change proposal to establish an assistant executive officer, they would be a 2, but I'm a 2. Well, they would be a 1. Well, then they can't, the managers would not be able to report to another 1. So that's the compaction issue there. The request was for L, which leaves enough leeway for growth, and was substantially equivalent to like boards at those levels.
L was.
L was.
Was there a reason received why it was denied?
Unfortunately, there was not.
Can we find out why it was denied?
I can make every attempt at the direction of the board to find out what the criteria or what was used to form the denial. There may be a point though where that information is not appropriate to provide to me, and that it might have to go to the board chair.
I would like to move to charge Mr. Kaiser with investigating as much to the degree that he can the reasoning for the denial and what needs to be achieved in order to be successful with what our directive is to be able to hire an EO for the board and manage, and the not just management of the board, but the true EO level of what he is accomplishing.
We'll second that.
Any more board discussion? Any public comment? Hearing none, roll call please.
Katerina Elvey. Katerina Elvey is absent. Alicia Ben-Amen.
Yes.
Deborah Alviso.
Yes.
Jesus Dominguez.
Yes.
Daniel Drummer.
Yes.
Tanya McMillian.
Yes.
TJ Watkins.
Yes.
Thank you.
So I will make every attempt to collect that information. In any event that I run into any kind of obstacles, I'll reach out to the board chair and advise if there's anything that can be done before the next meeting, and then I'll report my findings at the next meeting as part of my executive officer report.
Thank you, Jason. And moving on, it looks like we're right up to agenda item 18, legislation report.
Yes, we do have, before we go into the legislation report, we do have an interested party that would like to speak on a particular legislative bill. Mr. Foe, if you wouldn't mind. So in some ways, we're taking public comment on the legislative report a little out of order.
Good afternoon, Stacy Defoe, Executive Director for the California Physical Therapy Association. Thank you for the time and allowing me to jump ahead in your legislative report to this bill. And the bill that I'm referring to is AB 387, which is the bill, the minimum wage for health professional interns. And this bill would reclassify allied health interns who are moving toward clinical or achieving their clinical hours as part of their clinical education. Will classify them as employees and require that they be paid a minimum wage. And we are very concerned about this bill as an association and the potential devastating impacts that it could have to our programs in California, our students in California, access to health care down the line if something like this should pass, and the employment opportunities available and people leaving the state to go pursue their education and employment elsewhere should something like this pass. The issue, there's a number of issues with it, but the biggest issues are that it would require someone to pay a minimum wage to all the students who are trying to achieve their clinical hours, and this would be accomplished by either the clinical sites who are doing this would have to pay the minimum wage and classify the students as employees, or the programs would take on that cost, and that would result in an increase in tuition for the students. So either way, if in the first scenario, we're looking at a potential issue where there aren't any clinical spots available, and clinical, as probably a lot of you know, spots are already not easy to come by. There's a lot of programs both in and out of the state who are looking at all the same programs and looking to find clinical spots for their students. Those would dry up, especially with the hospitals who've already indicated that they would just not take students anymore. Or again, those fees would go back to the programs. A lot of them are state programs who would just then increase their tuition in order to accomplish it. So there are a number of reasons why we feel that it would be appropriate for this board to take a position on it. I see here that the board has not yet taken a position, and the issues really are the impact to potential physical therapists in California, people potentially leaving the state because they can't get their education here, and then a potential issue with access to care for California consumers. So CPTA is requesting that the board consider taking an opposed position on this legislation. That's it. I can answer questions.
Do you have any idea, thank you, do you have any idea, so that I don't use my own assumption, what percentage of students doing clinical internships do receive some kind of compensation now?
I don't believe any of them I don't know what the percentage is, but it's not common practice for students to receive any sort of a wage when they're doing their clinical education. They're not employees, they're not working independently in any way. They're being supervised directly by somebody and typically can't even bill for their services. So there's not really an incentive, as far as I know, to pay a wage to the employees currently, or to the students currently.
Just looking at the language of the bill and describing its purpose and background on page 113, the second to the last paragraph, the statement for the purpose in the background is that it will ensure that allied health professionals who are currently required to work hundreds of unpaid clinical hours will earn at least minimum state wage. And these students are not working. That this is part of education. It's clinical education. It's not employment, and they are not allowed to work on their own. So I see a major fallacy just with the basis of what this bill is trying to accomplish.
At this point in the session, with the language as it's currently written, there is an unknown or a question on how it affects our particular model. Because the clinical hours are collected as part of the education, and then the education as a whole is a requirement for licensure, it's a question between, the chicken and the egg, which came first. There are some board models where the education comes, and then as a requirement for licensure, there are a certain number of hours that need to be collected. So again, it's really just that chicken and the egg argument here, and speaking to the spirit or the intent of the legislature, I would see that they're going to see it that way, that they're going to see even those that are attaining clinical hours as a matter of education, because that education is a component or requirement for licensure, that they would see this affecting them as well.
Right. And I will say, we had, that was our initial response. We did see that it mentioned education, not licensure, and that there is a difference between those two. You can have one without the other. So we did reach out to the author and ask that question directly as to what is the intent of the bill. And they indicated the intent is to include all allied healthcare who are pursuing clinical education. So how that would be interpreted later, once the bill is passed, should it pass, is open to question, maybe interpretation, but the intent right now is that it would include everybody. And so at the very least, it would cause unnecessary confusion and chaos.
The other affected stakeholder that's relevant to this board is those applicants that are foreign credentialed. And so they have to do their 9-month clinical. This would affect them as well. And so where they might already have a hard time finding a clinical instructor and having to stand in line and that kind of thing, this might actually make it even more difficult, because now that clinical instructor would have to pay. And in those situations, to Deborah Alvisa's point, and the question to Stacy was, how many are already being paid? In the CAPTE model, I don't think that's an issue at all, none. But in the foreign education model, you find just about every model, some being paid, some paying, and some doing it as a volunteer pro bono kind of work just to get their 9-month clinical done. But if this legislation was implemented, it would definitely make it clear that anybody serving in their clinical, under a clinical instructor, would have to be paid minimum wage, which might make it that much harder to get volunteer clinical instructors.
So on that scientific, have you had any response from your members as far as some saying that they'd be willing to do it, some say they'd be not willing to do it, or?
All of the response that we've received, bar one student, is highly opposed to this bill, because of the long-term implications that we're talking about as far as potential for programs to close, because you have to meet the CAPTE requires the clinical hours, so does the Practice Act, and if you can't meet those things, then you can't have a program. So we'd be looking at programs closing, or again increasing tuition, or what have you. So.
And you'll see in the bill analysis the number of different colleges and institutions in California that are in category of opposition. I mean, it's a fairly long list.
Now, as far as where the bill is right now in the process, and I know you'll cover it, but it is in appropriation suspense file right now because of the costs attributed to it. And if you look at the appropriations letter, the report, they could be astronomical. So right now it's sitting in suspense. We'll know tomorrow morning if it gets out of that suspense file, and if it does get out of the suspense file, then it would go to the floor likely next week for a vote. We're not sure where it will end up. So if the board considers this and decides to take a position, I guess my recommendation would be to probably wait and see what happens in the other house, and then possibly send your letters over, starting with the next house.
Yeah, thank you. That was going to be my suggestion to the board, that if it is something that you're thinking about considering, make it contingent upon its status after today. So if it stays in suspense and effectively the bill turns into a Interior bill, then we'll deal with it next year. If it does make it out of suspense and it is something that you wish to convey a position to the author, make that a part of your motion.
On a procedural note, possible board action on any of the legislative items is not agendized. So if the board wanted to take a particular position on this bill or any of the ones we're going over today, I would recommend having a properly noticed meeting for another time, rather than making any motions today.
Any further questions or comments?
With that statement, I would request that in the future that any legislative items that are presented in our agenda book be noticed for potential action.
Yeah, because if this bill gets through, the August meeting will be too late for opposition.
Okay, any further board discussion? Questions for Mr. Foe? Any public comment? All right, hearing none.
Thank you so much.
Mhm.
Okay, so going back to the legislation report, June 2nd is the last day to pass bills out of their house of origin, and September 8th is the last day to amend on the floor. October 15th is the last day for the governor to sign or veto bills passed by the legislature by September 15th. As shown on the legislative summary, which is on page 55 of the materials, the board's monitoring quite a few bills for impact. So I'll go ahead and go through the legislative summary and provide a brief update, as many of the statuses of the bills have changed since we distributed the meeting materials. So starting on page 55 with AB 12, this is the State Government Administrative Regulations Review. This bill is duplicative of AB 12 from a prior session, and that bill died in the Senate Appropriations Committee. It's currently in suspense at the Assembly Appropriations Committee. AB 77, the Regulations Effective Dates and Legislative Review, that's still with the Assembly Appropriations Committee. AB 149, Criminal Procedure Disclosure Felony Conviction Consequences. An update to this bill on 510, it was referred to the Senate Public Safety Committee. Okay, AB 208, Deferred Entry of Judgment Pretrial Diversion. This bill is somewhat duplicative of AB 1351 from the previous legislative session that was vetoed by the governor. We included both the letters of opposition that the board sent to Assemblymember Eggman and the governor in the meeting materials. AB 349, Civil Service Preference Special Immigration Visa Holder. This bill was passed from the Assembly and ordered to the Senate on 5/15/2017. It's currently in the Senate Rules Committee for assignment. AB 387, minimum wage health professionals interns. As of 5/3, this bill is still referred to the Assembly Appropriations Committee on suspense. AB 505, physicians and surgeons probation. This is still a suspense file in the Assembly Appropriations Committee, so no changes on that bill. AB 508, healthcare practitioners student loans. On 5/18, this bill was referred to the Senate Business Professions and Economic Development Committee. AB 706, the Medical Board of California licenses. This bill is actually now dead. It's similar to AB 483 from the last session, which the governor vetoed. The board's executive officer met with the author last session and explained the board's proration process for licensees. And this session, the author did not include the board in that bill. AB 767, Master Business License Act. This bill is actually now dead. AB 1005, Professions and Vocations Fines Relief. This bill is still in the Assembly Appropriations Committee. AB 1510, Athletic Trainers. Let's see, this bill is also dead.
I have a question. Is this bill truly dead, or did it go to suspense for potential to be brought back in a second year? I believe that it was withdrawn. My recollection was that it was withdrawn from committee because it wasn't going to pass, and it's potentially could be brought back next year to a 2-year bill.
We'll get that answer for you right now. The last update that we had on it was that it failed a deadline. And so, but I'll pull it up right now. Yeah, so on 4/25/17, there is an indication that the hearing was canceled at the request of the author, so it may very well be a 2-year bill.
Okay, AB 1706, this is the board's sunset bill. And on 5/10/2017, this bill was referred to the Assembly Appropriations suspense file. SB 27, Professions and Vocations Licenses Military Service. On 5/10, it was placed in the Appropriation Suspense file, and on 5/19, this bill was set for hearing on May 25th. SB 572, no bill analysis was included with this bill as it failed its deadline and is now dead.
Going back up to AB 1706. No, we're not going to take a position today, not agendized, but is it appropriate to?
It will be at some point.
And considering that bill and the AB 387, I'm wondering if there should be consideration of a meeting between now and August.
So this is earlier than I anticipated discussing this, but while I agree and I appreciate Tara's point about the way it was agendized, there is a point of language on our agenda that says any discussion item or report, the board may take action on it at its discretion. And I agree with Daniel's comment that moving forward, everything should have, when it deals with legislation, discussion and possible board action. But given the disclaimer that is on the agenda currently, I'm wondering if it's still not actionable.
Thanks for pointing that out, actually.
I would tell you my advice would be not to take action on it today, mainly because when DCA reviews the agendas, it's being very careful about whether or not, especially on legislation, whether the board might take action on it. And when asked that question on this particular agenda, I said no, mainly because I was not made aware that there were any items the board might want to take a position on. So I'm just saying it's an issue DCA is aware of. So potentially you may want to schedule another meeting to take action on a couple of the bills as you've discussed.
Have we taken action on a bill in the past without it being noticed specifically?
It's not really a fair question.
Okay, sorry.
Only in that, I don't mean that to be that abrupt, right?
You're not fair.
Only in that the discretion being applied to Begley Keene and the way these agendas are noticed has grown over the last couple of years. So in the past, have we taken action on a bill without actually having the title, discussion, and possible board action? The answer to that question is absolutely yes, because having that title wasn't a requirement at the time. Again, I'm a little flummoxed by the idea that under informational notes, we would even be able to put that then. What purpose does it serve? Agendas, discussions, and report items are subject to action being taken on them during the meeting by the board at its discretion. And I appreciate council's advice. I would just make that known.
Just so I'm clear. So in past meetings, when we have taken a position, we have not noted it under that agenda item that we could take possible
Correct.
positions.
I would have to look and re-verify it, but a good example that's on this agenda is the Eggman bill, where in the last legislative session, the same language was proposed, and this bill took an action. And I would have to go back through the materials and look to see if discussion and possible board action was actually part of the title of that. It was at a different time, in a different environment. But the concern, that's the reason for my speaking up. So that bill in particular is something that if we had taken action then, I don't think anything's changed that we wouldn't take action today. And so my intent was to make the recommendation that we mirror our behavior from the previous legislative session and let the author know that we have an issue with that particular bill.
And that was my question, what changed and when did it change?
A good portion of that change or that added level of scrutiny is a result of the North Carolina Supreme Court decision. So.
Any further board discussion? Any thoughts, Deborah? Dr. Albiza?
I think I would just ask, Tara, can you tell me kind of how the lead-in comment on the agenda materials of action may be taken on any agenda item, kind of where that would apply and why that phrase is there? How?
Yeah, that language was added at the suggestion or really requirement of agency at the directors meeting with all the board members and EOs, I believe last September. So they provided us a new agenda format, and that language was present in there. So to the extent there's action that could be taken on an item that isn't otherwise enumerated for board action, I recognize the conflict. But if we're taking care to let the public know what the board may or may not do at each meeting, transparency for the public's, for their participation, it makes more sense to follow the direction to delineate on the agenda that the board might take action rather than have it in a footnote effectively. But I appreciate the point. It is on the agenda.
I would also make a note that the rulemaking report suffers from the same flaw.
And if this is kind of a learning mode, then one suggestion might be that the well-prepared briefing papers might have in there the potential for action. The board will be reviewing this with potential action.
And the other suggestion, and it may be a little over the top, is that every agenda item that we list start with the sentence, discussion and possible board action.
I just want to clarify that the rulemaking report under items 19B and 19C, it does say possible board action. So unfortunately, I think because some items have that language and some don't, there's a perception that if the board is going to take action, that language would be there.
I see.
Does the board have a recommendation for, well, I don't know if that comes here or now, looking forward to another meeting between now and August?
You may want to bring that up during future agenda items.
Okay, thank you. Okay. Well, if we're okay right now, is there anything else, Brooke? No. Any further board discussion? Any comments from our EO?
No.
Okay, any public comment? Okay. And so we'll move forward to agenda item number 19.
Okay, so all rulemaking items that were adopted from the 2017 rulemaking calendar were included in the rulemaking tracking form. Also included in the rulemaking report is the updated DCA rulemaking process, which reflects the updated process for non-emergency regulations, which requires that the board submits for approval adopted regulatory language to DCA legal and agency before it's filed with OAL and begins the public comment period. This will extend the length of the rulemaking process for the board for all future rulemaking packages which will be considered in the timeline for anticipated rulemaking files. So I'll direct the board to page 214, and I'll go through each item on the rulemaking tracking form. The first item on the tracking form is the TOEFL English Proficiency Regulation. We're pleased to inform the board that OAL approved this rulemaking file, and it was filed with the Secretary of State on May 8th, and it will take effect July 1st.
Yay.
Okay, so the next item on the rulemaking tracking form is the Coursework Tool 6, and proposed regulatory language will be presented under agenda item 19B.
Before we get too far past that, when I say yay, I really mean that.
I feel it. I feel
That
it.
was a labor of love rule package. It was not an easy rule package, and And Becky and Brooke should be commended for their efforts and their patience. And again, what is kind of arguably a tumultuous time, the rules are changing. You go into preparing a rule package, and with as much experience that Rebecca Marco has serving as this board's previous executive officer, who better to know the road? Well, the roads changed. So they navigated it through it gracefully, and we're just happy to have that be effective July 1.
I'd also like to point out their persistence. I think
Yeah.
it took a lot of stamina to get that one through.
And Tara is invaluable in that calculation as well. So between the three of them, and probably with me as a hindrance, they managed to get it done.
Thank you, all three of you.
Thank you.
Good job.
Yeah.
All right, also noted on the tracking form is rulemaking to address the examination passing standard for setting the examination score, and we'll be proposing regulatory language under agenda item 19C. All other items on the tracking form were added to the 2017 rulemaking calendar that was adopted at the November 28th meeting. And so staff are still researching those items, and we'll be hopefully presenting language in the future. As a side note, we have submitted another set of Section 100 changes to OAL. Those are changes without regulatory effect. Most of those changes were cleanup and addressing authority citation and reference that have been revised or repealed. So OAL does have 30 business days to review that, and hopefully those will go through. Okay, moving on to 19B. So staff are proposing two separate regulation packages. The first rulemaking file would do the following. It would amend CCR 1398.26.1, which would restructure the coursework tools into an outline format for ease of reading, and also adds coursework tool 6 as an option for foreign applicants. This would afford an applicant to use either the coursework tools corresponding to their graduation date or be able to use coursework tool 6. The other amendment proposed in this file would be under 1398.26.5, which would strike subsection C since the effective date has passed. It updates the PT clinical performance instrument issued by APTA to the current November 2006 revision date, and corrects the typographical error on the third sentence. In addition, it would add CCR 1398.26.6, which would add clarity to 1398.26.5, which can be confusing since it speaks to two separate and very different certifications. And finally, it would amend CCR 1398.38 to update the clinical site information form issued by APTA to the current January 2006 revision date, and it would also renumber 1398.38 to 1398.27, which was, it's actually included in the Section 100 changes that we just submitted to OAL, the repeal of 1398.38. So that the regulation is grouped into Article 2, with other like provisions as opposed to being in Article 3. Since the meeting materials have gone out, we've been working with legal, and we did have a few minor edits to the language, so I'd like to refer you to the handout that was passed out. Most of the changes were grammatical in the first heading, where we corrected a few small grammatical changes there, and then we also inadvertently left out under 1398.26.1 the introductory paragraph. So we added that back in on the handout that was not included in the materials.
Can I ask a question? This is an updated, this is creating the update to coursework tool 6 for foreign educated license, or education credentialing. Previous to that was what was called, what was previously used?
coursework tools 1 through 5. And we're not suggesting the removal of 1 through 5, it's just the addition of 6. So, in the event that a foreign educated applicant wants to come to California, currently, their credentials are going to be evaluated based on the year of their graduation. And so, I don't have them in front of me, but as an example, 78 through 91, they would be using coursework tool 2. This language reads that they would either be able to use 78 to 91 coursework tool 2 or coursework tool 6.
Who makes the choice?
They do,
They,
the applicant. So that really fits in when that person has gotten a transitional DPT or a doctorate. They may want to be equivalated to today's standards, which is coursework tool 6. And so the language allows for that flexibility. Meaning, if I don't want my staff to be in a situation where they see that their graduation dates were 78 to 91 and they have coursework tool 6 and we say no, you have to be evaluated at the time of your graduation, which is a lower standard. So, but for those that are graduated past June 30th, 2009, they'll be required to use coursework tool 6.
so they can use either. I think the part for me was, to me it's not clear who gets to decide that, so I thought the Credential Evaluation Service was gonna get to use it, which made me think everyone was gonna be subject to coursework tool 6.
No, absolutely not. So we're not, that's a good point. I don't want to create that confusion. The retro tools, as we call them, coursework tools 1 through 5, will, for California, still be in existence, given our statutory authority that the evaluation is based on the year of graduation of their education.
What is the purpose and or benefit of giving an applicant a choice between using the coursework tool corresponding to their year of graduation and coursework tool 6? Why would we give them a choice?
I think, really, other than for flexibility's sake for the transitional DPT students, nothing.
Is that
There
a
is
decision that the applicant makes with the credentialing company?
there is a outside influence, if you will, to consider.
Okay.
Because California can't adhere to that particular eligibility requirement for the national exam, these applicants may be applying in other states, getting their credential on coursework tool 6, however long that might take them to do so, and then eventually decide to come to California. And so we want to leave that door open for them.
That makes sense. That makes sense. Thank you.
And because it's an eligibility requirement enforced by FSPPT, there are a number of jurisdictions in the United States that are adhering to it. So foreign educated coming from Florida or Michigan or New York are going to have been evaluated on coursework tool 6.
Is it true that each coursework, that they're almost sequential, that they did get, they're expanded as time has gone, or they're more extensive as time goes on?
Yes.
There was never a dip in requirements that
No.
they, okay. So
Cap
could it
E.
be that one that is at least at their graduation level?
Oh.
It could, but if that foreign educated PT was licensed in a state that only used coursework tool 6.
It would be.
I see
Oh, I see.
your point, but I don't see the mechanical occurrence. I think what I'm thinking is, because coursework tool 6 is going to be widely adopted nationwide, and I'm going to have foreign applicants that may have been educated in the 80s and 90s, who have, as a result of their pursuit of licensure in another state, have gone back to school and fulfilled requirements and been, brought to coursework level 6 standards, that I want to be able to accommodate them coming here. That's a real mechanic. I see that happening. I don't see them, as an example, being a graduate of 78 to 91 and somehow getting a coursework tool 4. I just don't see how it would happen, I guess is the.
I'll tell you what my fear is. What I was afraid of when I saw this was that somehow the interpretation of this someday might be that the Credential Evaluation Service chooses 6. And that it becomes a
Sure.
barrier for someone that really should be under 4 or 5.
Sure.
And I think it may be, if that's not the intent
Mhm.
or the desire, there may be something that can be simply the wording.
Yeah, because as it reads now, it says, as amended, would afford an applicant to use either the CWT corresponding to their graduation date or CWT 6.
When I look at the language, it looks like the Credential Evaluation Service itself will be making that determination.
Where are you seeing
That's
that
what
at?
my concern is.
Yeah.
Where are you seeing that at?
So, on page 223,
Okay. Oh,
in section 1398.26.1, in subdivision A, third line or second line down, it says the Credential Evaluation Services will evaluate. So they're the ones who are making this determination. They'll evaluate foreign education credentials based on either the corresponding CWT or the coursework tool for foreign, and that should be educated, not education. Physical therapist, CWT 6.
okay. What was I reading that line that just said afforded to the applicant the choice?
So that might be in the description.
This is, what is this? Yes, it's in the background paper, right? Yeah. Mhm. So it sounds like we might want to change the language. What do you think, Dr. Drum? He's giggling and I'm asking him.
I'm struggling with the idea of changing language at this point.
Okay. Dr. Dominguez?
Same.
Ms. McMillan?
Pass.
Mr. Watkins?
I'm working through this because if the evaluating agency, as it is in the language, is making that determination on 1 through 5 for people prior to from 1 through 5, that's up to 2009. So that is basically, then when it comes to choosing coursework for 6, they just do this that is the criteria and nothing else.
I think for language sake, it's a pretty easy fix to make.
Okay.
But as far as practicality goes and history, essentially the evaluating agencies cater to the jurisdictions. So this wouldn't be the first time that we've had a difference in either coursework tools or EARLERs or any type of evaluations where the evaluating agency will just reach out to the jurisdiction and ask, what do you want us to do?
Mm-hmm.
But for the sake of language, I think that sub A could stay, with the exception of removing either, intact, and end at evaluation tool right before the or. And then a new sub B could be any applicant could use coursework tool 6 or a language along those lines. So For the purpose of determining educational equivalency for physical therapist licensure, the Credential Evaluation Services will evaluate foreign education credentials based on the corresponding Federation State Board of Physical Therapy coursework evaluation tools, and then list them 1 through 6. And then a sub B could be, anyone could use 6.
That effectively sets up a double requirement. I mean,
In lieu of the above, anyone could be evaluated using coursework tool 6.
so is it the board's experience that the applicants themselves know these coursework tools sufficient enough to tell the evaluating service which coursework tool they want applied?
There are 4, and this board would make an effort to communicate to them what the intent of this regulation was ahead of time, before its enactment.
But the regulation should be able to stand on its own.
Sure,
I need you to
absolutely.
explain it.
Yeah.
Okay. I just want to make sure what we're trying to accomplish, because I don't know. I just want to make sure that I understand if
We want them to evaluate it, and we want them to either use it based on their year of graduation or coursework tool 6, one of the two. Now, there's not a choice, whichever one's most beneficial to the applicant. And I understand that's pretty much the part of the language that's missing, is the intent of whatever's most beneficial to the applicant. I'm comfortable, but again, I understand with the idea of clarity of language. So.
Right, so rather than just leaving it up to the evaluation services to just pick one, which potentially could just all be coursework tool 6,
Which would be something we would have to correct.
in practice, would the evaluating service review the applicant's information and select the tool that most benefits the applicant?
That is how it works today,
Okay,
1 through 5 retro.
okay,
And we have transitioned from a set of retro tools that we call ELIRs, which were California specific, to the national standard for FSBPT's coursework tool, and ran into a very kind of similar situation with the evaluating agencies, where we had to provide information to them that after this date and time, we want you to stop using the ELIRS evaluations, and we want you to start using the retro tools, the coursework tools for FSBPT. Those evaluating agencies were already very familiar with the coursework tool from FSBPT because they were using it for their all non-California clients. We were special. We had our own. And so as we came into the fold, there was a little bit of education between the jurisdiction and the evaluating agencies. But again, there's 4 of them, and one of them is FCCPT, which is the offshoot from FSBPT that created the tools to begin with.
who really likes coursework tool 6,
Yeah.
and if they had their way,
Uh,
that would be what they would broadly apply.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this allows that. That's my concern.
Yeah, and I see that,
I don't think it allows for it because the word either is very specific.
yes, and if an applicant, a foreign educated applicant came to California and said, I do have my license in this particular state, and I did have my credentials looked at, and it was used with the coursework tool 6, then we're saying we do accept that coursework tool 6.
And I could see a stalemate situation where Deborah's correct. FCCPT, as an example, could stick to that and say, yeah, we're not providing the retro tool evaluation services anymore, to which the applicant would have a choice of 3 others that do.
That's true. Yeah. And I don't know if FCCPT won't use retro tools. Yes.
I understand the regulation should
Can you
be.
identify yourself?
Oh, I'm sorry. Sarah Conley, manager of the Applications and Licensing Services Programs. The regulation should be clear, but if there was question about what could be accepted by the board, could refer back to the statute, because that clearly says that we evaluate based upon the year of graduation. So the evaluation agency couldn't evaluate them at a higher level than the year they graduated. I don't know if that's an option.
Unfortunately, the regulation itself the directive isn't what the board will accept. It's the board telling the services agency how they're going to evaluate the applicant. So I think to be clear, if the directive from the board is for the evaluation services to use the tool, one of the following tools that is most favorable to the applicant, we need to put that language in. So we're directing the evaluating service to use the appropriate tool based upon each individual applicant, rather than telling an applicant or the service what we're willing to accept. I mean, I know
I kind of don't see the difference right now, but
perhaps I'm not explaining it well. This is a licensure requirement that the board is telling everyone that they have to fulfill.
Mm-hmm.
The way this is drafted right now in statute, it's telling someone else, a third party evaluating service, you're going to evaluate these applicants using one of these tools.
So is the solution to the language removing credential evaluation services and applying applicant? The applicant shall have been evaluated?
I think we can do this in a number of ways. One of which is the credential evaluation services will evaluate, insert, and applicants, that's apostrophe S, back to existing language, foreign educational credentials, strike based on either, and insert using one of the following tools that is most favorable to the applicant. And then we just list the tools. But that then.
But I think you lose something there.
Okay.
Because it still needs to have the corresponding to their, you couldn't, that would open up that
Mm-hmm.
Anybody
someone
could use
have
any
the
form.
one from 1980 apply to them. So it's not just most favorable.
Okay, so it's either what specifically applies to the applicant based upon their graduation date or coursework tool 6.
Yeah, the way it's written.
How about an applicant may request the credential evaluation service evaluate using the corresponding or coursework tool 6?
Still think you run into the approval process at that point. So they may request it, but it still sounds to me like, based on the language that's there, that it's still up to the evaluating agency whether they do it or not.
So somewhere in there, we need to put language that shows that it's the applicant's choice. So what if we left the sentence as it is, and at the end put a comma and inserted something like, at the applicant's discretion, or per the applicant's choice?
Just another suggestion.
Mm-hmm.
So it would read, for the purposes of determining educational equivalency for the physical therapist licensure, the applicant will direct the credential evaluation services to evaluate the foreign educational credentials based on, can we use that language? So the applicant will direct?
I could see, it could work, I could see the applicant calling the credentialing agency and asking them for direction, even though they're the ones directing and making the choice. I think it might work to leave it as it is and insert at the end per the applicant's choice. The service will evaluate the applicant with the corresponding tool or coursework tool 6 per the applicant's choice, or whatever words. We want to make sure that it's the applicant making the decision, right? Not the credentialing agency.
What if it said, what if it said the applicant must direct the credential evaluation? Blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, I still see applicants asking the credentialing service for direction. It's the whole thing is difficult. It's a difficult process.
What if you move per the applicant's choice at the beginning of the statement versus the end of the statement?
I will tell you, just as kind of a matter of insight, should this regulation, currently, should we have been presented with a similar situation within the retro tools currently? As a matter of approval, if I have an applicant who was graduated in '78 and is using, typically should have used coursework tool 1, but for somehow, some way, through a mistake or what have you, or an oversight by the evaluating agency, managed to get evaluated on coursework tool 3, and they were still considered equivalent, I would make the approval.
You're
Be
right.
at least,
Right.
You're
be
right.
at least equivalent to their graduation.
Mm-hmm.
Which kind of goes back to that first recommendation, is if I just struck and I took the coursework tool 6 option, the or, out completely, it could fix it, because I could still address those out-of-state applicants who did happen to get evaluated in coursework tool 6 because of the other jurisdiction's requirements and eligibility. Would still make the same decision and make the approval.
If you inserted the language "at least," there would be no need to mention any number after coursework tool. Would there?
That's matter of the coursework title, though.
Oh,
They're actually titled coursework tool 3 and
1, 2,
coursework
3,
tool
4, 5, 6.
But at least, I think, still provides, at least based on their graduation date, on at least the corresponding Federation of State Boards of Physical Therapy coursework evaluation.
Dr. Aviso, do you have any language recommendation for that?
I don't. I'm actually hoping that Tara can make it just legally clear.
Can the credential evaluation service offer the choice?
Of what?
Offer the choice to evaluate the foreign students on these 2 different options.
They can tell them, per your state law, that you can use the coursework tool at the date of your graduation, or you can use coursework tool 6.
Yeah, so they can offer,
Mm-hmm.
because
They will. Mm-hmm.
because then can we use language that then directs them to offer that, as in the credential evaluation services will offer the applicant the choice to be evaluated, will evaluate the foreign educational credential based on those 2. Because what we are struggling with is trying to get the applicant to have a choice in the tools that are being used.
Are we? Is that what we're trying to do?
Well, here's the thing, for the purposes of regulatory language, the evaluating agencies themselves are not within the jurisdiction of the Physical Therapy Board of California. You have to be very careful in the language and how you craft it, and assuming that you have authority over them. Now, strategically, you can write the language and it leaves them no other choice, which creates that kind of niche of business to begin with. They only exist because we have this requirement. Having said that, they offer a service for money to another person, and we don't have any jurisdiction over them other than whether we'll accept evaluations from them or not. So writing that language into the regulation kind of gets into a really tricky ground to say the evaluating service shall offer, because we don't have that kind of authority over them.
Right.
Well, we wouldn't put it, while we wouldn't put it in language, it is something,
It's
I mean,
something
they
we
do give the applicant the information per their state's requirements.
Absolutely. Specifically for California, because
Yes.
you've been so different in the past.
So I like the language that Dr. Alviso brought up as far as at least,
Yeah.
because really, we're trying to be sensitive to a foreign educated PT who may have been licensed in another state and already used the coursework tool 6, and we're saying we'll accept that.
If you think of the understanding of the scale of these coursework tools, so coursework tool 1 essentially is the CAPTE accreditation standards for that period of time, right? And so on and so forth. So I'm just going to go back to that kind of idea that if we just took the option of or for coursework tool 6 out, that everyone after June 30th of 2009 would now be on coursework tool 6 because it is equivalent to the CAPTE standard for today, and will be however long it's going to take until coursework tool 7 is created, and we'll be back here having this conversation again. That it seems logical to me that I wouldn't force someone who managed to get a coursework tool evaluation higher than their year of graduation to go back through the process and say, no. I know you have a coursework tool 6, but you need a coursework tool 2. You know, so as a matter of practicality, I think just the subtraction of the or fixes the problem when it comes to what would be provided by the evaluating agencies.
Do you feel like there needs to be language in there saying at least? So that it gives them the option to use, or the option to have already used in another state possibly?
Yeah, my first knee-jerk response is to say, yeah, I think at least works, unless it confuses the matter, and then it's not worth having.
Like,
So I need some clarification myself. Are you saying that on and after a certain date in 2009, all graduates
From a foreign education program.
are evaluated on coursework through coursework tool 6?
So this is important because remember, this regulation is being put into place because coursework tool 6 is new. So that is the intent. That is what will happen, but there's a transition of a period of time. So right now you have graduates that have graduated after 2009, a good number of them, but their evaluation is at coursework tool 5 because 6 never existed up until now.
So do we need the or only for that set of graduates?
No, so the or, for me, the value was, and again, I don't know that I needed as much as I thought as I did before. The or was, because FSBPT is enforcing the eligibility requirement for the exam at coursework tool 6, and other state jurisdictions have adopted that. If you wanted to be licensed in Michigan, even though you were typically in California a coursework tool 3 candidate, because you went to Michigan, you took supplemental classes and you raised your assessment up to coursework tool 6 anyway, so you can get your Michigan license. And now for whatever reason you change your mind, you want to move to California. Well, I don't want to put that barrier to licensure and say, no, I need you to go back to the evaluating agency and get a coursework tool 3. They already have coursework tool 6.
Okay, so I'm not sure, I don't understand deleting or, because there's more to that sentence and the list.
Well, no. So deleting or only until it goes to PTA Tool 2007. Oh, I'm sorry, 2017. So you would leave, for the purposes of the subdivision, the 6 following publications are incorporated by reference. You basically provided direction to the evaluating agencies that use the corresponding tool as you see. So if they were graduates of a 1993 program, they're going to use Coursework Tool 2. For California, that's the difference I think that's important. Because if they go to Michigan, they're going to be using Coursework Tool 6 no matter what.
Mhm. Okay. So effectively, you're talking about striking from this language. So I'm on 1, 2, 3. I'm on the 4th line down after CWT and paren. You would put a
Period.
period, strike or the coursework tool for foreign educated, should be physical therapists. To the end of that sentence, you would just strike all that.
That's all I would strike.
That
And
makes
then
sense.
the new sentence is fine.
The new sentence is fine because it's, and I'd also strike the word either from the addition of the language.
Right,
So,
okay. I have one other question. In listed item 6, that revision date, when I go to that actual, the FSBPT materials, on the bottom of that, it says revised 2016-05. So I'm wondering if 2016-10 is correct, or if that should be 05.
I'll double check for you, but my recollection is 2016-10 is correct. The materials that you have are outdated.
Okay.
It's a good question. I think '05 is when coursework tool was actually finalized, and then it had to go to the board for, the FSBPT board for approval to use, and so that might be why it's 10.
Yeah.
But it's a good question.
I'm only bringing it up so that we can get the exact revision date for OAL purposes. Because we're having to incorporate it into this regulation, we have to point to the correct version of it. So perhaps just double check the 10 to make sure that's the most current version.
So how does the board feel about striking or through?
Daniel, Dr. Drummer,
That works.
Dr. Dominguez?
Yeah, that's fine. I just had. Sorry. I just had a little singular and plural, since we were striking or and beyond. It says physical therapy course evaluation tool. Yes, we have 6, but corresponding, I think, fixes it for me.
It does. Corresponding to a singular.
Okay. Ms. McMillan?
It works.
Dr. Alviso?
I think it's good.
So far, so good? It's fine with me.
Fine with me.
What's our next step?
Moving on to 1398.26.5.
Oh, I'm sorry, public comment.
Sarah commenting again. Should we do an effective date for Course Tool 6? Because the education requirement would have changed from 5 to 6 because it drops off after 2009. Should there be an end date for 5 and move into 6, or am I incorrect in that?
I asked that question when we were reviewing it before this meeting, and my understanding is that all of these dates are included because that's the actual title of the tool.
And so for me, that's not, if I was an applicant, I would think, oh, after 2009, I need to use
Yeah,
5.
the only problem with 5 is it's hard to determine when the next CAPTE accreditation change is going to occur. So, coursework tool 5, oh no, you're right, that's just a title issue.
Because 6 would be is the current one effective, I think it was January of this year.
Right,
So
so
we would
I
need
think
an
that
effective date for 6.
that gets back to the corresponding
Yeah.
tool. So I don't think the dates are determinative as much as the applicant's actual facts of their particular application. So if they graduated in 1978, they're going to a particular tool.
But these say,
But
because it identifies the year of graduation in the other titles, it is a little confusing. So, but if that's part of the title issue, then
But Sarah, you're bringing up a good point,
Yeah.
because then there isn't any, when you're saying for
Yeah.
corresponding, then when I look at 6, I never know when it corresponds.
When does it start?
yeah.
My question, I guess, just maybe gets to the root of that, is where is the education component here? How is the applicant informed or guided to make the best decision for their case? Where does that process live? Who sort of manages that?
That would be information on our PTBC website, right?
Well, you know, we're struggling with this idea that it is the title of the coursework tool itself. But for that 6th coursework tool, there is you could in parens put who graduated from start to finish for 5, and then who graduated from for 6, as a point of information in the regulation. While it's not necessarily part of the title of that form, it speaks to Dr. Dominguez's concern that how does the applicant know which one applies to them?
Mm-hmm.
And we can get that information, that's not a problem.
So putting in parentheses for physical therapists, foreign educated physical therapists who graduated after blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, so in 5 in particular, right now where it says who graduated after June 30th, 2009, it would be in parens who graduated June 30th through whatever the end date is and the implementation date is of 6. And then another paren insert for 6.
Okay, so we need to be careful about confusing the language because the titles themselves have parens and then we have to include that in this regulation because we're incorporating it by reference. So any modifying language we use to describe the dates for these particular tools should most likely come after the last paren. So in this case, it would be the revision date, and perhaps not even in parens, because that way, we just do a comma, which applies to graduates of these dates.
It just becomes a matter of format at that
Right.
point, because under each bulleted 1 through 6, you could start off with for those who graduated between 1978, who graduated before 1978, FSPPT coursework tool for foreign educated physical therapists who graduated before 1978. I mean, you could literally put the requirement, the year parameter on the beginning, making it a little bit easier for the reader. 2 would be, for those who graduated from 78 to 91, this is the tool that you would use. 3, for those who graduated from these dates, this is the tool that would be used.
Okay, so I'm concerned that those might be substantive changes to the language because then we're really starting to define in regulation. So I'm just putting this out there for everyone to think about, that perhaps this language would have to come back to the board for another approval once we add those dates. However, we can work through we can do most of the heavy lifting here, and then come back and make the tweaks And so everybody can see it one more time. Just so we're clear that, if there's any question as to substance, the board has reviewed it and approved it. That's just a procedural note. So perhaps for purposes of moving the meeting forward, the board is considering adding specific language to the beginning of each individual coursework tool to clarify for applicants as well as the service agencies or evaluation services the years of graduation that apply to each coursework tool.
Okay, any further board discussion? Public comment? Dr. Alviso?
Sorry.
No?
If this is gonna go a little bit back to the drawing board, you guys are gonna look at it, make sure that by doing the things you just talked about, that you aren't avoiding, if you haven't still, end up with that problem of somebody who's had a higher one applied to them.
I would say that, if there's an error, do we know about it as the application is coming through to us?
We've never really run into an instance where and if you think about it logically, the likelihood that it could possibly happen isn't really there. So the CAPTE accreditation had changed so much within the span of 10 years that the person that graduated from 92 to 97, the likelihood that they could be evaluated and be considered equivalent to the FSBPT's coursework tool 4, 98 through 2009, it's unlikely. It would almost raise an eyebrow and somebody would say, how come I'm not equivalent? And then the mistake would be discovered and they'd go, oh, we're sorry, we evaluated you on the wrong form. You actually should have been on coursework tool 3, and guess what? You're good. You're ready to go. Never had that experience, that I know of.
Though it's not included in the title of coursework tool 6, the description of 6, sorry, I just lost it, as to who it applies to, includes the language that coursework tool 6 is based on CAPTE evaluated criteria for PT programs August 2014.
Mm-hmm.
So that means 5 will include 2009 to 2013.
That's the idea.
It just hasn't been, 5 hasn't been retitled to say 9 through 14.
Correct. And for all intents and purposes, I don't know that they will. I don't know if FSBT is going to go back and change the title on coursework tool 5, given they don't want retro tools anymore.
Yeah.
So that's
As far
why
as I understand it, they do recognize that they are existing and that they're being used.
Right.
And so perhaps we can we find out if they are
I can.
renaming them? Something tells me that might be a possibility, that they are in the process of doing that. Okay, further board discussion on this item? Public comment.
Okay, so moving on to the next section, 1398.26.5.
I just had a question, not even not really an issue with it. Is that there is no longer a requirement for the certified clinical instructor, or is it just moving? Is it just being reordered?
It's moving.
Got it. Thank you.
Okay, so I also have a question. Is it an option for the board to consider moving away from using the CPI for foreign educated applicants and moving toward using the performance evaluation tool that's been developed by FSBPT that is specifically developed for foreign educated applicants, whereas the CPI is specifically developed for entry-level physical therapy students?
Absolutely.
If that was something we would we consider before we even move forward with this?
You might, and that consideration would be of the boards as well. So I think proactively and kind of planning for the future, that's a good strategy to look at the PET versus the CI and the clinical performance instrument. It doesn't really assist or help out with the issues that we have today where we're using an outdated tool currently. So this regulation is kind of a first step at the solution of updating today's system, but without overhauling it completely just yet. But if this board wanted to look at using the PET instead of APTA's clinical performance instrument altogether, that's something to consider. And then that's the assessment that I'd ask the board to make. Is that big of a change warranted or wanted enough that we don't worry about making the small change first? We just go for it.
Is the board interested in hearing more about the new tool, the PET, that was developed specifically for foreign educated applicants? Or is the board happy with the route that we're taking now? Any thoughts? I'll start with you, Mr. Watkins.
Well, I would like to know more about the new tool, and then make the assessment if this is the first step, if this is the way to go, or if in fact the better route is to just go with the new tool.
I think it would be interesting to take a look at it because it was designed with that in mind, as opposed to we've made another tool fit over the years. If that's something that you're involved with the Federation?
I got to take a look at the tool and how it's used by both the supervisor and the applicant. And I would love for the board to take a look at it, and then we could make a decision together whether it's something we like or we don't.
So my only input into that is I'd be happy to invite the Federation to come out to maybe the August meeting or the November meeting and provide that as a presentation so that the full board can see that as an option. Keeping in mind that is a much larger regulatory change and a transition, politically speaking. Right now, your assessment of foreign educated is based on APTA's CAPTE accreditation for equivalency. And to a certain extent, it's validated by APTA, the professional association. So you're switching from that national standard professional association that governs pretty much the education of everyone else, CAPTE related, to now the FSBPT's new product that, while it is designed specifically for that intent, it's a different body,
Yes, I understand. And the validation of the CPI by the APTA is specifically for entry-level physical therapists.
The other benefit to the FSBPT PET product is that it is validated by an independent third party. I mean, it has it stands on its own merit. It's been taken before an auditing committee, and they validated it themselves.
Ms. McMillan, would you be interested in looking at it? Based on your enthusiasm?
Yes, I would.
Dr. Dominguez, any comment?
Really nothing more than I'm a big fan of options and choices, and it may be that it just serves to sort of reinforce the process we have in place.
Dr. Fallon?
Sure.
Okay. And so it sounds like the board's interested in looking at it. How would that affect what we need to do today?
So the question that I would ask is, because of that interest, do you want to table that change at least until after you've seen that presentation and can have further discussions about what that other product looks like? Because you may be considering it as an option or an alternative. We will, if that is the case, we will halt, working on that particular section of language and focus on the other portions of that regulatory package, and we'll try to set something up with the Federation to come out and do that presentation. I had already been contemplating having them out to do licensure compact, so maybe do both.
Full truck for that.
So is the board okay with tabling this one item and moving on?
Yeah.
Any public comment? April?
Okay, moving on to 1398.26.6, supervising physical therapist or for an educated applicant.
Well, they're kind of related.
I see that word.
They're kind of related at that point. So the SCIFs really are kind of a secondary requirement to the CPI. So it kind of goes back to what I was saying before. If that's the case, we just table those two sections for later discussion.
As well as 1398.27?
Yes.
Okay. All right.
Before we leave it though, I think there's a huge value in making sure that anyone that might be filling out the PET is also a clinical instructor certified by FTA. I don't want to lose the value in that. So we'll just keep that in mind as part of the thought process and consideration when we get to that point.
Yeah, that would be a good question to ask the opinion of FSBPT.
Sure.
See what they think. Any further board discussion on this item? Public comment? Brooke?
Okay, so moving on to agenda item 19C, and this is the second rulemaking package for the board's consideration, which is on page 314 of the meeting materials. And this proposal would amend section 1398.28 of the CCR. It would defer the passing score for the NPTE to FSBPT. It would ensure that the examination score is always current and consistent with the score set by FSBPT and the rest of the member jurisdictions. The current amendments, I just have to point out, the current amendments only, proposed only address passing score for the NPTE and not the CLE. So going to the proposed language, 1398.28.
Silly question, is the exam for the assistants also called the NPTE?
It is.
Okay.
Counsel?
We have a special guest from the Office of Professional Examination Services that just wanted to be able to provide a little insight. If you could introduce yourself.
Good afternoon. I'm Heidi Linster. I'm the Chief of the Office of Professional Examination Services, and I just wanted to address the board regarding a possible change to this proposed regulation that was mentioned in your board packet. It was indicated that you might include the CLE in this regulation, and I wanted to recommend that you not include the CLE as part of the proposed change. Because if your board does decide to work with LPES to update and maintain that CLE, it wouldn't make sense to have the FSBT set the passing score. And OPS has been talking with Jason, and we are looking forward to potentially working with you on your CLE. OPS develops most of the state-based examinations for all the boards, bureaus, committees of PCA. And we developed your exam when it first was updated several years ago. And we look forward to working with you again. Do you have any questions?
Thank you.
And given where we are in that particular process, Heidi and I are in agreement. I don't recommend including that language within this regulatory package. Setting the pass point for the national exam is something that we've had on our rulemaking calendar for quite a while. So handling it now and dealing with the California law examination in a separate rulemaking package, I think is probably the most prudent way to go.
And I think it makes sense for you to allow the national to accept their passing score recommendation. I think that part makes perfect sense.
Board have any thoughts, any comments? Thank you, Heidi.
And also, I'd be happy to come to the board at any time that works for you to give a presentation on OPES and our services and how we develop and update examinations.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Looking forward to that.
I have one comment. I still don't know why we're potentially adding to the reference section, section 2638. That reference doesn't quite make sense to me. And that section deals with re-examination. It's just a one-sentence statute that says any applicant for licensure as a PT or PTA who fails to pass the exam required by the board may retake the licensing exam and shall pay the re-exam fee. So, typically with reference sections, they're listed because this regulation is going to implement them.
Mm-hmm.
So, while I appreciate it's all about a jam, this particular section does not mention re-exam or any fees for that. So, I don't think 2638 should be included in the reference section.
Does anyone have any reason why it should be included? It sounds like we can strike that then. Yeah, okay. Any other comments or discussion? Anything needed by the board at this point?
A motion.
Anyone feel moved?
I take a cue from the materials provided. I move that we approve the proposed text for noticing 45-day comment period. Direct staff to take all steps necessary to initiate the formal rulemaking process. And if no adverse comments are received during the 45-day comment period and no hearing is requested, delegate the executive officer the authority to adopt the proposed regulatory changes as modified, including the removal of the one reference, and make any technical or non-substantive changes that may be required in completing the rulemaking file.
I second. Any further board discussion?
Just a clarification that it's identified that that motion is pertaining to
I was just going to do that. Thank you.
1398.28.
Yep, and I still second. Thank you, Dr. Drummer. Any further discussion? Any public comment? Hearing none, roll call vote.
Katarina Ellaby. Katarina Ellaby is absent. Alicia Benet-Min.
Yes.
Deborah Ohiso.
Yes.
Jesus Dominguez.
Yes.
Daniel Drummer,
Yes.
Tanya McMillan,
Yes.
TJ Watkins.
Yes.
Thank you.
Just a point to note, thank you for the motion, and we'll move forward. This will be the first rulemaking package that goes through that rather extensive flow chart that's included above it. So it's kind of it'll be a good waterline for us to test against to see, this is, for all descriptions, a fairly simple rulemaking package. The authority is required. We'll make a compelling argument why we should defer it to the, administrator of the program or the administrator of the exam. So just keep an eye out on how that moves through the process itself
Sounds good.
and temper your expectations.
I do see that we do have some reports to finish up with, but I would like to request a 5-minute recess, short recess, and then get right back to it.
Okay.
Thank you. Record. And we are picking up with agenda item number 20, Administrative Services Report.
Good afternoon. Carl Nelson, and I'm Administrative Analyst for the Board, and I'm going to discuss the budget. I actually have a couple of additional items that I just wanted to talk about today, beyond what we normally report on. Was noticing, we've been noticing for some time that our expenditures are down, and we are probably going to be reverting a large amount of money this year into the fund. I just got a DCA projection, and they said that we'll be reverting about $460,000, which is about 9% of our budget. Normally, just to put that into perspective, we would have 2 to 3% reversion. There's a few things about that actually. DCA, when they do the projections, they don't know everything about our program and how our spending goes. They're not privy to how many cases in enforcement that we have left and things like that. But in this case, it does look like we are going to have a large reversion. And so one of the things that we've decided to do was submit a request for architectural revolving fund, which is allows us to spend money for things like capital improvements to the facilities that we're in, or a move. And we have requested from the Department of Finance that we can put $200,000 into that fund. That fund would be good for, originally that would be good for 3 years. So anytime in the next 3 years that we need to access it for a move.
Have we already requested that?
Yes, it's at Department of Finance right now for approval.
Okay. And just moving back a little bit, can you talk about reversion a little bit, please? Explain it.
Sure. Reversion is simply the amount of money that you have left over at the end of the year in your budget after you've expended all of your items, and that money simply goes back into your fund. So it's not as if we're losing that money, but when that money is available and we can put it to use, we thought it was wise to go ahead and do that.
And so by asking for this fund, that will lower our reversion amount?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, exactly.
Thank you.
That's all I have.
That's all you have? Well, before you leave, are there any comments or questions from the board for Carl?
Is that the only place we could allocate funds to? The architectural fund?
That's the, I mean, we could spend money on a lot of different things, but as far as actually putting something aside, and being that it seems as if we are going to need to move, we're really, really in a small facility at this point.
And Carl already kind of touched on this, while we typically only revert about 2% of the allocation, that doesn't mean that a 10% reversion is a bad thing. It just, in our cases, it just shows an example of prudent spending and good planning. There are no other mechanisms or tools for us to kind of use to keep that money separate from going back into the fund, and I'm okay with that because the fund is just going to be rebudgeted back to us next year. And the whole idea of this last fee increase was to establish a more healthy fund for this board to begin with, keeping in mind the unanticipated costs in the future that there's no way we could tell what they are. So to help me get better sleep at night and have at least a double-digit, month fund in reserve, we're well on our way to that, and being able to establish a set-aside, a rainy day fund, if you will, for the move that we all know is going to happen inevitably. This year was an ideal opportunity for us to put it into what we call an ARF, or an architectural revolving fund. That $200,000 seems like, I don't know, to me, if I was a layperson, I would consider it to be exorbitant. But to move this board to another location can be extremely costly. So usually when you move from one location to another, you have to buy all new furniture, right? So if you've seen the cubicle furniture that we have now, a very conservative estimate is there's about $10,000 of cubicle furniture per person. Well, there's that many of us easily to soak up that $200,000 real fast. So the $200,000 may not even be the end all to our move. It's not the solution, it's just an assistance. And so next year, if there's another revision, if we don't manage to move, we might make another ARP contribution to that same fund. But we are actively looking for space now. DCA and DGS both are aware of it. Whether that means we move to a different location somewhere in Sacramento or just upstairs in this building. And if you can see my employees shaking their heads out in the crowd right now, you can get that there's a divide in that opinion. That's what the $200,000 would go for.
Okay. And so after that fund, what would be our reversion amount?
So if we would drop down to about 260,000 at that point, which would be a much, I'm not exactly sure the percentage offhand, but it would cut it in half at least.
Okay. And you started by saying that our expenditures are down.
Right, which is one of the reasons that we're able to, that we are reverting so much money. Well, it is the reason we're reverting so much money is because, especially in consumer protection services, I'm not sure about the caseload there, but we have definitely had less expenditures.
And that's something we can't really control, right?
Well, actually, no, we can.
We can?
So that's part of it. So there definitely has been, and you'll see in Elsa's enforcement report, there definitely has been a drop in the number of complaints received. But we also have a better handle on how the cases are managed at the AG's office and DFI and that kind of thing. So that in and of itself is a way of controlling costs, holding those outside entities accountable to the services they provide.
Any further board discussion? Any public comment? Thank you, Carl.
Thank you.
Okay. Moving to agenda item number 29, application report.
Sarah Conley, manager of the Application and License Maintenance Services Programs. Good afternoon. First of all, I'm going to start out with just a couple notes on the report as far as the data that's provided. Well, the first item is just a labeling note, is the year-to-date is the total of the current reporting quarter. So the year-to-date is what we currently have through quarter 3. The format didn't, or the template didn't get updated to actually identify that, so I just wanted to make sure that was clear. Also, just a reminder that the year-to-date data is still comparing legacy system data and fiscal data to Breeze data, which is what we currently have. So there's just a little difference. This will no longer be the case as of July 1st this year with the 2017-18 fiscal year data. So in November, we'll actually be comparing Breeze data to Breeze data. We won't have that difference anymore. The quarter-to-quarter data, so Q3 to Q3, is mostly Breeze data. We didn't start Breeze until January 19th, so we're almost all on Breeze when it comes to comparing the quarters. So that's it on just some general information. As far as applications, with the exception of equivalency applications, applications received has increased about 30%, and the PTA licenses issued number has increased due to the increased number of applications received as well as the change in resource distribution. So we got through some of the backlog in the PTA applications. Unfortunately, although we've increased our workload with about 30%, we've dropped our resources about 30%. We lost an analyst. Ms. Kristen Lee took an opportunity at another agency. So we're really sad to see her go, but we wish her the best. With that, I have to really commend this existing staff on, keeping everything afloat while we're down. And just to give you an idea, as of May 12th, we have approximately 1,415 applications that are pending. So, and we have 2 analysts, that are assigned to process applications. We do have another lead analyst as well as a support office technician to assist with those duties, but just, assigned analysts, we have 2. And 1,400 applications. So they're doing a great job. We're really doing the best we can. We've been maneuvering timelines and making accommodations to try and get all the applicants through the process as expediently as possible. But we are finding we're having to be held to our processing times. We always have a goal to exceed them, which we were doing, but now it's really getting closer to established processing times. And with April's apps received, which is not included in this data, April looking to exceed, to have an increase from the previous year. So continuing that trend of increasing applications received each year. So growing licensee population.
How many analysts should we have?
Well, we have 3 allocated to the program.
But we have 2 right now.
We have 2 right now, so we're down a third. Which we're recruiting for that position, but it takes some time. And it's our busiest time of year. So the timing wasn't great, but they're really doing a great job.
Were those the positions that were in your report?
Point 8?
Point 8 for administrative services, 1 position complete for. To put that into perspective and to kind of answer your question in a different way.
Yeah.
How many analysts should it be?
Mm-hmm.
There's a 33% increase on this sheet statistically. And that's been the problem that this board has suffered from over the years, is that we have not managed to grow as fast as the industry and the profession has. So as there has become more licensees, we are not, commensurately or proportionately growing at the same rate. And we've done we made a lot of progress catching up. I mean, we went from 13 positions to now the 22 we have now. But we're still a little bit behind. And we're falling farther behind as you start seeing these numbers grow over time. But that's what the BCP process is for. And so where you see I'm answering that kind of question in a roundabout way, is how many analysts should we have?
Yes.
As many as it takes to get the job done, that the stakeholders are satisfied with the performance. And so you still get a lot of feedback that says, it's not quick enough, you're not, license. So we take that into consideration too. And then workload, what is feasible? And so we'll always be, admin with the help of administrative services, we'll always be taking a look at doing a workload analysis and saying, there's too many applications coming through the pipeline for 3 people to reasonably handle or manage in a reasonable amount of time. And so we'll look for, hiring another whatever 0.2 or 3 or 8 or 9 or 1.4, whatever is appropriate at the time.
And to add to that, is something that we addressed in previous meetings, the fact that Breeze, even though it is more efficient, it's also doing more. So in processing the applications, we're entering more information than we ever did in the legacy systems. So it's more efficient, but it's also doing more. So it's requiring more of the analysts. And the other part of that is you think, more efficiency, more technology, great, less draw of resources in maybe phone calls or emails. But we're finding that's not the case. The applicants, licensees, they still want that human interaction. It's not going to go anywhere. They want to talk to someone. They don't want to have to.
Anyway, because it hasn't even been 1,000 days yet.
But yeah, it seems like you're not going to ever lose that need for human interaction. So
Sounds like physical therapy.
in keeping with the so if there weren't any other questions, I don't have anything specifically for the examinations part of the report. So at this time I can take questions, and so I can move on to license maintenance.
Discussion from the board. Public comment. Sarah? Yep.
Okay. So in license maintenance services, as reported, the licensed population and licensees in retired status are growing. As expected, PTA is higher. The increase, there was a couple of notable changes in the statistics. The name changes, that was addressed in the briefing paper, that was due to how data was collected and how things were processed. The other thing I wanted to mention was the increase in duplicates issued. That is happening. It seems like it's partially attributed to returned mail, and that's something that we're tackling right now. We've historically been addressing return mail, how to approach it, because we do get quite a bit of return mail. And it seems like that, so address issues as well as employers are requiring the pocket license. So licensees are needing that before they could go online. It seemed like when we transitioned to online verification, it's like, oh great, we can just do that. Now we're going back to, no, we want the pocket license. So we're seeing that licensees are calling and needing them, not just like, oh, well, I didn't get it. So we're keeping an eye on the return mail as well as the number of duplicates we're issuing and what's going on with the mail, which is pretty involved because it has, the issues with post office and things like that. So,
I'd add to that,
yeah.
Sarah. So I've received a lot of feedback about employers requiring a hard copy of the license for their file for employment. And while California doesn't require that, we're not a carry state, your license just has to be in good standing to practice. It doesn't necessarily mean that the employers or the insurance or the malpractice insurance companies don't want the employers to have their records straight and proof of this and proof of that. I would say that it's a little misleading to think that because they have a pocket license in the file for auditing purposes, that that's some kind of protection where if they verified it on the website real time and printed it out and put it in the file, that's actually more current and up to date. The other thing is the duplicate increase also might be a direct result from Breeze, because now it's a lot more accessible to get to a duplicate request and pay for it with a credit card online, where before they would have to write a letter and write a check and have it cashiered in-house. So it's definitely a resource draw, both in duplicates and in endorsements, but they both have their own reasons for existence at this point.
Working in a hospital that is mandated by the Joint Commission to have all of that information available for review at a moment when Joint Commission is in the middle of survey in the hospital and they're reviewing a patient's records and they see that Dr. Dominguez was the one who is providing physical therapy intervention for that patient. They want to see Dr. Dominguez's file. They want all of it. They don't just want, they want the copy of the pocket license and they want the online confirmation.
So that was my next question at that point, was because, not to belittle Dr. Dominguez in any way, but it is possible that his license would have been suspended or revoked in the interim of that review since the care was administered. So, but you answered that by saying, and then they would also do a license verification to make sure that that's not the case.
And as the one in my department who's currently charged with accumulating all of those things, I'm only doing an online verification at the moment. We're not doing it when JCHO comes through and then providing it at the when they're there. We're printing out a copy of the verification, of the online verification, and putting that in their file.
Yeah.
And so it's the same thing, but that's where HR is at this point.
And I will tell you, from an employer's perspective, I consider that process to be much more primary source. You went to a secure website, got the information, printed it yourself, and put it in the file. Where the hard pocket license, your licensee had an opportunity to adulterate, alter, change, counterfeit, and hand to you to put into the file. So just another shout out to the electronic process.
Along the same lines, when you're talking about licenses or addresses, I recently changed my address of record to my work address because my home address is changing. So I decided I'm going to change my address of record to work. That has certain perils for me because the mailroom at the hospital sometimes doesn't get all of the mail, or sometimes things take longer to get through the mailroom to get to my mailbox in my department. So I'm nervous about that. Is there any way, and I'm wondering, is there any way to be able to declare preferred mailing address? That my address of record is where I work, and that information is valuable, I think, to the board in case of the need for investigation. But
so I think there's a happy medium to this. So the address of record is absolutely used for the mailing purposes and communication. The residence address requirement really speaks to that. We want to know where you lay your head at night, so if we had to have an investigator come out and take your statement, they would. And while you've put your employment address in the address of record, in anticipation of a move later on down the line where you'll be updating your residence address, and I appreciate that, for purposes of this conversation, should a complaint have been filed against you and I needed to send an investigator out, they're going to go to the residence address first, which might not be current and might not be the right place to go. But you using your employment, a P.O. box, mailboxes, etc., or something like that, if you have concerns about whether or not your mail is going to be delivered to you timely, there are a couple other things that you can do. I would imagine that you are an avid user of the Breeze program. You have an account set up.
I am.
And you've used it. So that's a better way to determine, communications with the board. And if you're going to be receiving a renewal statement, you can always log into your own account proactively and find out. And you're paying there anyway. So it's like kind of a one-stop shop. So, but as far as mail goes, coming from us to you, it's going to go to the AOR. It's gonna go to the address of record.
Okay.
That's all I had as far as the licensing statistics report. I only want to continue competency if there's no further discussion. Okay. So, as you know, the staff has resumed continuing competency audits. Audits are performed quarterly, consistent with other activities, data collection, and reporting. Therefore, the results of the first quarter of audits for those licensees who renewed January through March will be reported at the August meeting, because we're conducting those audits May through June. However, I do have some information for you today. We have 98 active approval agencies, 141 on file, so we're still resolving some of the outstanding issues with them. There are over 600 providers, which has doubled since the last time we updated the records. And we have over 13,000, almost 14,000 courses that are being provided. And the audit percentage, the selection for each quarter is 10% of the renewing population. So for this last audit quarter, it was 185 licensees selected, PT and PTA.
I'm sorry, say that one more time, how many?
185 licensees were selected for audit. And the outcome of those audits will be reported at the August meeting. Prior to conducting the audits, staff was collecting and updating the approval agency information, which is what I provided. And staff has identified agencies that have either requested to have their recognition withdrawn or have been unresponsive. So pursuant to California Code of Regulation 1399.95J, subsection J, approval agency recognition may only be removed by members of the board. Therefore, today staff is presenting for your consideration proposals to remove recognition of 4 approval agencies. Each issue paper includes a detailed account of staff's interaction or lack thereof with each agency and reasons why staff is recommending recognition approval. Just briefly, I will go through each one. Number 1 is ABC Pilates, and they've requested that the recognition be removed. Number 2 is Advanced Training Specialists, which no longer exists as an approval agency, and they have requested that the recognition be removed. The last, there's 2 all grouped together because they have the same situation. Color 7 Education LLC and Global Augmentative Communication Innovators. Neither of those agencies exist any longer, and we haven't had any communication with them, or successful communication with them to continue having them as an approval agency. And so we're requesting that for these 4 agencies that their recognition be removed today. Now, how that happens, I'm not sure how the board wants to approach it. If you want to do each approval agency and consider each one and then do a motion on that, or just review them all and do one motion withdrawing everyone's recognition.
Council, do you have any advice?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
Take the recommendation of each recognized approval agency one by one with a motion from the board, or group them together.
I'll take them one by one.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
So 4 motions? Yes. Yes, 4 motions. Any further board discussion? Any public comment? Board discussion?
Move to accept the request of ABC Pilates to withdraw their recognition as a continuing competency provider.
Second.
Any discussion by the board? Public comment? Roll call vote, please.
Katarina Elby. Katarina Elby is absent. Alicia Benaimit.
Yes.
Deborah Alpiso.
Yes.
Jesus Dominguez.
Yes.
Daniel Drummer.
Yes.
Tanya McMillan.
Yes.
TJ Watkins.
Yes. Second. I move to withdraw approval agency recognition from Advanced Training Specialist.
I second. Any board discussion? Public comment? Roll call vote, please.
Katerina Ellaby. Katerina Ellaby is absent. Alicia Urbina Amen.
Yes.
Deborah Alviso.
Yes.
Jesus Dominguez.
Yes.
Daniel Drummer.
Yes.
Tanya McMillan.
Yes.
TJ Watkins.
Yes.
I'd like to move the withdrawal of the Color 7 Education LLC approval agency recognition.
Second.
Any board discussion? Any public comment? Roll call vote, please.
Katerina Ellaby. Katerina Ellaby is absent. Alicia Urbina Amen.
Yes.
Deborah Alviso.
Yes.
Jesus Dominguez.
Yes.
Daniel Drummer.
Yes.
Tanya McMillan.
Yes.
TJ Watkins.
Yes.
I move to remove Global Augmentative Communication Innovators from the Continuing Competency Provider List.
A second.
Board discussion? Public comment?
Katerina Ellaby. Katerina Ellaby is absent. Alicia Urbina Amen.
Yes.
Deborah Alviso.
Yes.
Jesus Dominguez.
Yes.
Daniel Drummer.
Yes.
Tanya McMillan.
Yes.
TJ Watkins.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The last time that this board removed recognition from a recognized approval agency, I was in charge of this process. And so I can provide a little insight into how difficult this is. And Yasha Crutcher is sitting in the audience, and this is the labor of her work. So it's a bit like herding cats. It's hard to keep track of that number. And when we were talking about the 33% increase in applications alone and how that might lead to having to hire more staff at a later date, there are only 2 people in the audience that work in continuing competency. And so tackling the audits themselves and now auditing the recognized approval agencies as well, I think you'll see at some point that in and of itself, by a measure or analysis of the workload, is going to require an additional staff for that as well. So what they've done up to this point should be commended.
Yes.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
I don't have anything else.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you.
Sarah. Moving on to agenda item 23, Consumer Protection Services.
Hello, my name's Carol Phelps. I'm an enforcement analyst in the Consumer Protection Services unit. And I will be bringing you our CPS report. Of note, we have added an analyst, Marty Kincaid. In addition, we've had David Laxton just filled a new position for us. He was a staff services analyst, and now he's an associate governmental program analyst, and he's got a caseload as well. So, attachment A1 to your briefing paper is actually not available. I don't know if you noticed it wasn't attached. Yeah.
I went back and forth and back.
Yeah, it's not there. It was not available. We were waiting for it and hoping that DCA would have it for us, and it was not available. For attachment A2, solar statistics. Some of it just varies with what we receive, and we have no control over what we receive. Some of it is managed by us with our caseload, and some of it is in the hands of the AG or the Division of Investigation. So, of note, the 4th section on that first page, the investigations aging. I wanted to point out to you that the fiscal year 2015-2016 year-to-date percentages are incorrect. The way they're reported to you, we noticed that and got some new information, but not in time to print it for you. I'll just read it down if you want to note it. If you have any questions, let me know. So where that 49% starts, that should actually be 60%. The next one's 21%, then 7%, 5%, 3%, and 4%. So, and that's for the last year's fiscal year. So this year, to date, actually 73% of our cases are being closed within 90 days. And obviously it goes down from there. There are still some cases you'll continue to see this over 3 years because there are still those straggling cases that there's very few of them and we get them closed as we can, but luckily there was none in January through March. We were up to date at that time. If there's anything, if you have any questions about any statistics, please let me know. And the last attachment is your disciplinary summary, just with the disciplinary actions that we've taken in the last quarter. We did only have, I say only, but it's kind of a high number. 2 ISOs were issued, interim suspension orders were issued in the last quarter. That's all I have. If anybody has questions about anything, I see them.
Any comments or questions from the board? Any comments from you, Jason?
No, thank you.
All right. Any public comment? No. Thank you, Carol.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And agenda item number 24, probation monitoring report.
Monty Martin, probation monitor. Good afternoon, board.
Good afternoon.
Today I'm presenting the third quarter statistics for the probation monitoring program, which ran through January through March of 2017. Attachment A1 refers to the probation statistics for that time period as well. There are currently 93 licensees on probation for various causes. Of those 93, 25 probationers are now tolling or not receiving credit toward the completion of their probation. Of those 25 currently tolling, 7 of those probationers are now residing out of state. So of the 68 licensees that are currently receiving credit toward the completion of their probation, 20 of those are now enrolled in the board's drug and alcohol recovery monitoring program. Which equals 29% of all of the licensees on probation or that are receiving credit. If you refer to your chart, the attachment that goes along with this report, you'll see that 3 new probationers started probation with us during that quarter. 6 completed probation. There was 1 probationer that stood to a voluntary surrender. And there are currently 93 probationers. During the same quarter, 3 new probationers entered into Maximus, which is the drug and alcohol program. 1 completed the program, and there are now 20 total Maximus participants. And during that same quarter, 2 licensees that entered into the Maximus program were considered to be clinically inappropriate for the program, and so they were immediately released. Any questions on anything?
And just a quick question. When it's determined to be clinically inappropriate, do you have any, or maybe it's Jason even, any knowledge about, that whole process on what the respondents will go through, what that whole program entails, that initial 30 days? Because that's the evaluation period.
Yeah, so their first contact would be with the clinical case manager at Maximus. My understanding is that clinical case manager will do their own assessment of an incoming licensee to see what kind of issues they may have with drugs and alcohol and to determine if they need any further treatment besides what we could provide to them, like inpatient, outpatient treatment, anything like that. They are also scheduled to undergo a full clinical assessment by an outside person that contracts with Maximus. I'm not too sure what kind of tests they provide or do. I believe there is some kind of psychological evaluations that they undergo. And the clinical assessor also goes over that person's life history, family history, history with drugs and alcohol. And then those two assessments are combined, or they talk about what they discovered, and then a decision is made whether or not that person needs to stay in the Maximus program, or if they are considered clinically inappropriate. That means that those two individuals feel like that person doesn't need any further services, or they're not at a level to where our program would benefit them. It would be like someone had one DUI and it was a mistake, but they weren't determined to have like a drinking problem. And so they're released from Maximus and then they're tested just with the board. But they don't have to go to like Alcoholics Anonymous or health support groups in addition.
Your question spurs the thought, though, that I think it might be timely that this board receive a presentation from Maximus on the services that they provide.
Yes.
And we're starting to stack August up a little bit, but we haven't maxed out yet. So we can reach out to them and see if that's something that they're willing to do for us. It is it's much easier to digest coming from them directly.
Yes.
Especially when you start to get into the CDE or the clinical diagnostic evaluation. And
They
the standard
routinely offer to speak to you guys. So they say anytime the board wants to hear from us, just let us know, and they're willing to come out.
We
So
were
we'll
maybe kind of wondering if the person was considered not to be a substance abusing licensee, but maybe through the history that the outside source took, saw that there might be benefit to other counseling type services. Is that something that would go along
They could recommend that, but we don't,
provide it?
or we don't have the.
Maximus's focus is it's a very narrow focus. So
Okay.
it's that of substance abuse. So if in the clinical diagnostic evaluation it's established that there is some other disorder or ailment that might benefit from a different type of therapy, they might make us aware of it as part of the CDE,
Okay.
and at least make the respondent aware of it. But they wouldn't administer that therapy, and we would have no really authority to require it at that point either, given the authority that we have from 1441 and the uniform standards.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
I had a real quick one, Monty. With the probationers of the 25 that are tolling, so 7 are out of state residing out of state, the 18 that are in, probably have very limited information, but do you have a sense of why they're tolling? Are they having difficulty?
Yeah. As a matter of fact, I did speak to those individuals, and 11 told me, so the number would be 18 if you took out the 7 that are out of state. 11 told me that they have either left the profession and found work in other professions, or have just stopped looking for work in PT.
Okay.
And then the other 7 are still looking for work in the profession.
Thank you.
Anybody else?
I have the same question. Yeah.
I'm seeing a lot more insurance issues popping up too. That's one where it's leading to people wanting to leave the profession as well.
After one of our recent hearings, we had discussion about the potential for recommending that that these probationers look into the potential for pro bono, doing pro bono work, to be able to continue to gain experience and time in the field, so that they are no longer tolling, but maybe wouldn't be paid for that time, but to be able to potentially do something like that part-time, a couple of days a week, while they worked some other job to be able to support themselves, could be an option, and I don't know if that's something that you're able to counsel them on as far as things to look at, to consider, if they do want to stay in PT, that may be an option.
Okay, I'll definitely let those individuals know that if they want to volunteer, that time will now be counted.
Thank you, Ryan. So, no further discussion, and any public comment? Okay. Any public comment on items not on the agenda? Any agenda items for future meetings?
We have a unresolved issue in the 2017 calendar. We did hear back from Sac State already, and they would be happy to have us the week prior to accommodate Dr. Dominguez's schedule. So we'll work on those arrangements. Really, logistically, it doesn't affect members much because of the location of the school. You probably will end up in the same hotel and those kind of things, but we'll work with them as far as the typical and normal things, AB and that kind of thing. So if that works for you guys, we can adopt the 2017 calendar with those changes.
Okay. And that was the only change for now, right? That's it?
For 2017.
17, okay. Motion? Discussion?
Just to clarify, we're looking at changing the meeting currently scheduled for the 23rd, 24th to the 16th and 17th of August.
That's correct. And the location from Department of Consumer Affairs Evergreen Hearing Room to, I think it's the Folsom Auditorium at Sacramento State University.
I think you also wanted to add the San Diego CPTA conference to September. That's it. I just wanted to make sure that September 16 and 17 is reflected on the calendar.
Yeah. Thank you.
Was that a motion?
We need one.
Was that a motion? Somebody?
Yeah.
Yes, in gratitude, I'd like to move that we adopt the 2017 calendar with the proposed amendments.
And I'll second.
Thank you.
Further discussion? Public comment? Roll call vote, please.
Katerina Elby. Katerina Elby is absent. Alicia Urbina Amen.
Yes.
Deborah Alviso.
Yes.
Jesus Domingos.
Yes.
Daniel Drummer.
Yes.
Tanya McMillan.
Yes.
TJ Watkins.
Yes.
Thank you.
Any other agenda items for future meeting? Maybe a possible meeting to look at the board possibly taking positions on bills. Ms. McMillan? Is that you?
Yeah.
Yeah. Everybody in agreement with that? Yeah.
Just to throw this out there, that might be a good one for a teleconference.
Yeah.
Yeah, and as typical with a teleconference, the calling of that meeting is up to the chair. So we can confer and look at what's coming down the line and determine necessity. And when you call it, we'll let the rest of the members know, and we'll try to coordinate a date that works for everyone.
Okay. So we'll work on that. Any other agenda items for future meetings? I think we did it.
Hearing none.
Hearing none, this meeting is adjourned at 4:34 p.m. Woo-hoo.